If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this, what is the creepiest true story someone has ever told you? Way back in 5th grade or so, I discovered a glorious Pokemon-themed chat room through the wonders of Yahoo. Within this chat room, there were maybe 15 regulars, generally between the ages of 12 and 16 or so, and we had a great time role-playing various anime characters and storylines. Anyway, I got to know a few people from there well enough to chat with them on AIM or by phone, and a few of those friendships lasted a good 4 or 5 years. One of these guys was a little eccentric. He loved creature/monster models and stories, stuff like Godzilla, Spawn, whatever. He believed in things like chupacabras, which I thought was silly, but didn't really care, and he lived out in the boonies in some Midwestern state, which all seemed like hick land, to my young West Coast mind. After getting to know him pretty well and having a good 100 hours of phone conversations over the years, he finally revealed this lovely story. He told me that sometimes he would black out and wake up to discover that he had, or was still in the process of, hurting or torturing animals and children. He had quite a few cousins and neighbor kids who lived nearby, and apparently had killed some animals. When he revealed this to me, I felt sick inside. I love animals, and this information chilled me to the bone. It was really hard for him to tell me this, and he confided that I was one of the only people he had ever been able to tell. Then, it got weirder. Someone in his family, or maybe a family friend, decided that he must be possessed by a demon, and that they had to perform an exorcism. They did it at night, of course, in a dark room lit by candles, and he tied to the bed because they didn't know how the demon would react. He was choking up as he described this part. I could hear his voice quivering because he was so emotional and terrified at this part of the story. He described a pretty creepy process, but the worst part was the end. He said they heard something hit the floor under the bed when the demon left his body, and then something scrabbled across the floor and out of the room in the darkness, leaving claw marks in the wood floor. He was totally and completely serious about this, and how it cured him and he didn't hurt things anymore. I, as any sane person would do, noped right the duck out of that situation. Mom told me, when I was a wee lad, that I used to get up in the middle of the night and keep watch over the hallway. She'd see me sitting at the edge of my bed in the dim light. When she'd ask what I was doing, I'd tell her, "Shh, I'm waiting for them to come back. You need to be quiet or you'll scare them away." Second-hand story, but I asked the people who were there and they all say it's true what happened that night. I'm a logical guy, can explain away most stuff, and if I can't, I just dismiss it. But there's one story that I've been told by 4 different people in my family at all different times, and the story is the same. One night on the res, way back when, it must have been a year or 2 before I was born, there was an incident. I pieced it together because I heard different accounts from different rooms in the house where it happened. It was my grandma's house and everybody was gathered there for some reason. I heard there was something weird going on in the hills or something, so they all gathered together. My sister said the adults got really nervous and sent all the kids to bed in the same room. There were a bunch of kids lined up sideways in one of the beds. She said that all of a sudden something started to bang on the walls trying to find a way into the house. She lay in bed with all the other kids and then the adults broke out hollering and yelling. They were holding the back door closed. There were 3 men there, my dad, my uncle, and, damn it, I can't remember the third. The sound stopped and it was quiet for a few minutes. That's when one of the kids noticed a big shaggy head looking through the window at them. They all took off into the living room. What was happening at the back door was the 3 men were leaning on the door and they couldn't hold the door shut tight. Something would ram the door and it would open a couple inches and they'd push back and slam it back shut. Now my dad and uncle were loggers, hauling around big ass chainsaws back in the day all day. Whatever was outside was almost overpowering 3 of them. Finally, whatever it was left the back door, then they heard the kids screaming. Whatever it was must have gave up and left after looking through the window. Next morning, when they finally got up the courage to go and look, they saw that everywhere that whatever it was touched was muddy. The closest creek was down a long hill. Mud prints where it was pushing on the door. Around the entire house. And at the window where the kids were in bed. The window is about 7 feet off the ground. Now, logically, it was just a bunch of res drunks trying to break in. But, I asked and everybody who was there says that it wasn't. In those days, if it was drunks, Dad would have just gotten a stick and gone to town on them. Not to mention my uncle who was protecting his mom's place that night. What freaks me out about it is the mud and the big shaggy head part. To this day, if there's a window at night with the curtains open, I can't really look outside without a chill shooting up my spine. I always thought they were all putting one over on little FJ, but it's always the same story. Dad believes in Bigfoots because he's seen them. Closest he said he got was about 100 yards across a steep valley. He was cowboying down south of here and there it was across the way watching him. He said it was the freakiest feeling he ever had. He hustled his herd up after that. There's this other story he told, only once because it's probably not a happy one. His two brothers were riding, horses of courses, around this mountain near here and they found something. A little figurine or something? Statue? A little carved something at this. How to explain? Like an altar I guess, in the middle of the woods, up this mountain. They took it and then started having bad luck. Very bad luck. This was back when the area where I am was still pretty far behind the rest of the world. Roads would be closed for extended periods of time during winter and spring. Anyway, one of the brothers was working at the sawmill, just over the way from here. Believe me, everything is just over there, with Dad. They were out in the bush cutting down trees and hauling them in when a tree throned on my dad's brother, one of many uncles I never knew. Oh yeah, throned is what he calls it. When falling a tree and it splits up the middle before falling. Seen it happen a couple times and it's dangerous as hell, and it smashed his insides. He managed to get him back to camp, but they couldn't get out into town because the roads were too bad. So Dad had to watch his brother die a long painful death. So, one of the elders told somebody in Dad's family that it had to be the thing they took. They had to bring it back. So that's what happened. Still, whatever it was must have followed because the other brother disappeared. Mom told me this story and I never asked Dad about it. He is one out of 17 kids. Not entirely sure how long I can make posts, but I'll see if I can add a few more. My dad used to cowboy down west of the river and there are stories about down that way. Ghost stories like the time 4 of them were camping by these 4 trees. There was something about the trees and they knew they should have camped somewhere else, but they did it anyway. In the middle of the night when the fire was low, 3 of them woke up to one of the other guys screaming and yelling his head off. They all looked and could see a dark outline of the other guy hanging in midair by one of his feet. Somewhere in that same area, my dad and his cowboying buddy told me that there was a place that the cows avoided. Cows would lay down and not be able to get back up. Like they were stuck to the ground. They said that place was like a bowl shape, a crater I guess. But people that would try to make camp there would fall asleep and wake up feeling really heavy. I'm starting to nod off and my stories are getting choppy. So, I'll tell you this one last one that same cowboy told me about working down that way. He told me this after telling me his old cowboy ghost stories. Tells me, if you ever go down that way and go wandering around, you stay on those cow trails. Sometimes people go down there and they end up disappeared. It's grizzly bear area and pretty remote. I figured people just got lost out in the mountains or fell in the river or something. I asked what happened to those people. Well, those cows know not to wander off their own trails. There's deep cracks in the earth down there. Animals fall in them sometimes. People too I guess. Just go missing. To me, that was scarier than anything else they told me about down there. Imagining somebody falling into one of these cracks and stuck deep down in the earth, legs pinned and not able to get out. Dying that way has to be a bad way to go. I was down there when I was a kid, Dad showing us around his old stomping grounds. I see a rusted up old truck's hood sticking up out of the ground. I thought somebody must have just taken off the grill and fenders and put it there like that. Nope, there was a whole truck in the ground. About 6 months ago I stumbled across these things called skinwalkers. They're these Native American medicine men, mostly in Navajo and southwestern tribes, who are pure evil. They shapeshift and stuff. Look them up, they're creepy bastards. I'm half Lakota Sioux Indian so I've heard of them mentioned by friends and relatives before, and they're ducked up. They kill people after driving them crazy from fear. Anyways they prey on Indians and other ethnicities if you talk about them, but mostly Indians. Well I started reading stories about them and telling friends about the stories and how creepy they are, and people say if you talk about them they stalk you and kill you, but I didn't actually believe in them, so I figured I was fine. I keep this up for a week, then one night as I'm laying in bed I hear a tapping on my window and it doesn't sound muffled like a fingertip, but like a sharp rap from a hard pointy tip of a claw or knife. But I just calm myself and try to sleep thinking I'm just going crazy and spooked myself, but then it gets louder and clearer with more force, accompanied by a whispering sound, and at this point I know I'm not imagining it, so I pray for it to go away but it won't, so I grab my shotgun and open the blinds and nothing is there. By now I'm nearly shitting myself from fear, but I lay back down with my gun and it doesn't happen anymore, and I doze off, but as soon as my mind slipped away I hear this piercing sound next to my ear as loud as a megaphone. It sounded like an eagle's scream mixed with a bear's roar, and it's so loud I lose hearing for a few moments, and outside my window is just ferocious banging. My window began to rattle. So I start pleading for God to send whatever it is away over and over again and it just abruptly stops. Then about 10 seconds later my 3-year-old brother just wakes up with a blood-curdling scream and my parents rush in to check in on him and he said something was outside his window. The next morning I go to investigate outside and everything is normal except my brother's window screen had one large gash in it. I tell my parents about the things that happened in the night, about how I'd been talking about skinwalkers, and my mom got extremely pissed. She's where I get my Indian blood from, and curses at me but eventually calls our local medicine man over and he does a ritual and blesses the family a D. Since then we have been fine. But ever since then I decided not to duck with that kind of shit anymore. My high school teacher told us a story about his friend living in rural Arkansas. He, the friend, meets a girl at the Walmart register. They talk and hit it off pretty well. She is a nice religious girl, exactly like the one he wanted to be with. They exchange numbers. He calls, they have long conversations deep into the night. They go on dates. She is a genuinely nice girl. She ended every phone conversation with a prayer, "We thank our Father," or something like that. The guy is completely smitten. She finally calls him to come to her house at 7:30 one Saturday night. She tells him to come there at exactly 7:30 and not a minute later. She says that if he is even a minute late, she will break up with him. The guy was a little league baseball coach and had a game on that day. The game was supposed to end a few hours before that, so he accepted the offer. On the day of the game went into overtime, or whatever you call it in baseball. It went on longer than expected. The dude, coach, was getting a little nervous but he still had plenty of time. The game ended a little late, but 3 of the kids' parents hadn't arrived yet and he had to drop them off home. Panicking, he really doesn't want to miss his chance with the nice girl. He tells him to hop into the car and speeds off. After quickly dropping off the first 2 kids, he decides the 3rd kid's house is too far off, so he leaves him on the road and begs him to go walk home. Yeah, very douche move, I know. He rushes home, showers, gets dressed in a hurry and tries to go to the girl's home ASAP. He arrives at her house at 7:35, 5 minutes late. A woman in her mid-40s comes out and tells him Clarice, the nice girl who called him over, said you are late and wants you to go away. Heave. Dejected, he goes back home. A few days, or rather, the next day I think, later he sees the local news. He sees the house and it looks familiar. It is the girl's house. The police are leading a handcuffed woman out of the house. It is the 40-year-old woman that had spoken to him earlier. Behind her is the girl he was dating. He was shocked as the headline read child kidnappers or something like that. He expected the police to visit him soon as well, because he was dating the girl. Soon, as expected, a police officer comes to his house and asks him if he has name. The guy is nervous but knows his rights. He asks if he should get a lawyer or not. The policeman tells him that he is not legally allowed to tell him what happened, but felt a moral obligation. This is where the story gets creepy. The policeman says the women arrested were engaging in human sacrifice. In their house they found the missing children's remains. There was blood all over the walls and jars of hearts labeled with the names of the missing kids. There was an empty jar that had the dude's name on it. Turns out, the girl invited him on a date at her house at 7:30 to kill him in a ritual human sacrifice. The ritual apparently had to be executed with precise timing. His being late saved him from being ritually sacrificed. Needless to say, there are some crazy cults in rural Arkansas. I live in a really rural place, so it's not uncommon to have really long stretches of road with absolutely no civilization at all. No lights, no other cars, no nothing for miles and miles. One night, my friend was driving back from a bonfire party in the desert when she said she just saw what looked like a guy walking along the side of the road. She could see him moving way up ahead of her, and as she got closer, she started to notice that the way he was moving was very unusual. His arms seemed too long and she described his gait to me as nothing she'd ever seen a human being do. She said it was like he was constantly staggering, but never falling over. She told me that as she got close enough to pass him, she just knew that she didn't want to see this person/thing's face. She turned her rearview mirror away from her, drove by as fast as she could, and didn't look back. She called me later to tell me about this. She was actually really creeped out, because the person/thing had been heading in the direction of our town. In Beaumont, Texas, there is a place called Saratoga or Bragg Road, with some degree of paranormal history. I've gone a number of times with my family and sometimes you see a little something and other times you don't. However, one night that we headed out there was decidedly different. Our group piled into one truck for this. It's Texas, everyone has a truck. I was probably 16 or so at the time. It was me and my, at the time, stepdad in the truck bed and my brother, mother, 2 cousins, and my aunt in the cabin. We had decided to go to Bragg Road because it was a happenstance occasion. We all happened to be in town on a Wednesday night where none of us had to be anywhere the next day. We figured that nobody would be out there, which tends to improve your chances of seeing something. I've got an uncle with absolutely terrifying stories from the road, but that's a story for another time. The way things work on Saratoga Road is you drive slowly down the one-lane dirt road, and then if you want to you double back and drive it again. On our first run-through we didn't see anything even remotely paranormal, though we did pass by a sketchy group of young, college-aged, men and women who had pulled over into a small clearing in the swamp and were just leaving their car. They gave us some nasty looks, as if we were intruding. Well, we decided to drive back down the road a second time just to see what we could see. By this time we had forgotten entirely about the other group of people. We get to their little impromptu campsite and they've done some remodeling, so to speak. They had erected some kind of pole with a pentagram painted on an affixed sign and were standing around a campfire, talking softly to themselves. Remember those nasty looks from earlier? We got them 100-fold then. So we passed by the creepy group, my stepdad and I being the only two truly face to face with them. The others could just close their windows. Not 2 minutes later, we suddenly start hearing crackling noises. My stepdad pushes my arm anxiously and points up to the treetops, saying, "Holy shit. Look." Lo and behold, there are bluish-white motes of light, about 2 or 3 feet in diameter, rapidly fluttering about the treetops. They stopped for a moment, hovering about 20 feet above us before suddenly descending. Freaking out harder than I ever did before or ever have since, my stepdad and I begin banging on the window, screaming, "Drive! Drive!" My aunt, the driver, stops the car to ask what we were so freaked about, prompting us to scream louder. So we do our best to hang out as we suddenly take off from 10 miles per hour to about 50 miles per hour on this narrow, one-lane dirt road. The lights continued to follow us, getting closer all the time and making this noise. I can't really describe it as anything but disturbing. It had some kind of high-pitched ethereal quality to it, but it just felt alien. In the sense of not normal, of course. When we got to the end of the road we all bailed to our respective cars ASAP. We regrouped at a gas station a few miles away and compared stories. Everybody saw the same thing and heard the same noise. I don't believe we've been back since. So one summer when I was about 16 I took a job babysitting 2 girls MF while their parents worked. I would go over to their house early around 6 a.m. and their mother would leave for work. The girls generally stayed asleep till 10 a.m. so I would watch TV in the living room downstairs until they woke up. At first it started small. At some point in the morning I would feel like someone was standing behind me in the kitchen or at the staircase. I assumed it was one of the girls trying to play a prank and sneak up on me. I would get up, walk through the kitchen and then slowly creep up the stairs to see to try and bust them, but they were never there. This happened at least twice a week. Then one morning while I was watching TV the channels started turning. I assumed I was sitting on the remote and started looking through the couch, couldn't find it in there, and I turn around and realize it's sitting on the coffee table, not pressed against anything, and not only that the channels aren't flipping in order, they are changing as if someone is selecting them manually, first 12 then 34 back to 3 and so on. I run to the stairs to see if one of the girls is playing a prank, and again no one is there and the girls are in their rooms asleep. The final thing that happened that finally got me to bring the weird occurrences to their mother was one morning she asked me if I could help prepare for her daughter's birthday and blow up some balloons. I told her yes, and she gave me a pump to fill the balloons up with. Well, in the middle of doing it I got thirsty and set the pump on the counter next to the refrigerator. When I finished grabbing my drink and closed the door, the pump goes flying out the kitchen and rolls into the living room. At this point I'm still trying to be logical about it. I assume I must have shut the door too hard and that's what knocked it off and sent it flying. I pick the pump up, place it back on the counter and shut the fridge with the same force as last time. It doesn't budge. Then again, but harder. Nothing. After a couple of more tries adjusting the wear on the count of the pump was and the force of me closing the door, I came to the conclusion something else must have sent the stuff flying. That evening when I tell her mom the strange things that have been happening, she gets real quiet and says, "It's been happening to you too?" I was stunned. She then goes on to tell me that the TV thing has been happening to her too, and that the girls say they sometimes see kids playing in the backyard that aren't there. She told the girls not to tell me anything because she didn't want to lose another babysitter. When I was a little girl, my dad had a job that made us move to different states a lot. We ended up in a small town in Virginia when I was 5 and my sister was 4. We rented a very old house on Church Street. Almost immediately after moving in, my sister and I started having night terrors. That's not odd in itself. What was odd was that we could not be woken up, we were hysterical, and we were dreaming the same things. We would be screaming for mama, but our real mother couldn't comfort us. We would fight her. We would cry about all the dead people and say we were going to die, and that we didn't want to die. Freaked my mom right the hell out, and she told our new neighbors about it. They were freaked out. Apparently, Church Street was called that because a few hundred years ago, it had been part of the property of the town's church. During a horrible outbreak of cholera, so many people died that they ran out of cemetery room and dug a huge pit to throw the bodies in. Later, the mass grave was paved over and made into a street. My mom, normally logical and not one to scare easily, threatened my father with divorce if he didn't move us out of that area. She really believes my sister and I were being haunted, and that we were being taken over by souls of 2 little girls who had died and thrown in the mass grave. She won't talk about it much, which is fine with me. I vacation in Maine every year. We stay at my grandparents' house in mid-state. It's a very rural area. Most of the roads are dirt, houses are abandoned, ect. On her road, there is a cemetery, and a little further down, a really old, small house that's been abandoned ever since I can remember. My grandparents, who have lived up there for years before I started going up in the summer, cannot even tell me the last time it was used. Anyway, I was up there with some friends for senior week last year, and they, all guys, decided to walk down to this house, about half a mile from my grandparents' house, at night. Thought it'd be fun. I initially didn't want to go, but I also knew that if I wasn't there to keep an eye on them, they'd probably do something stupid like try to get onto the property, so I decided to go along to make sure that didn't happen. The house is visibly unsafe, it's posted as no trespassing, and there was a barbed wire fence around it. There's a huge full moon that night. I went down to the woods, and, asking myself what would Buffy do? I grabbed 2 stakes, partly for humor, partly for protection. We had 2 flashlights between the 4 of us, but the moon was so bright that we hardly needed them. So we're walking down, and the boys want to stop at the graveyard first. That didn't faze us too much. The moon was so bright that we could see everything, and it's in the middle of the field, so no surprises. Figuring the house could not possibly be scarier than the cemetery, we continued walking. In order to get to the house, you have to walk past a farmette. The owners have a light in their yard for security purposes, but the light doesn't extend really far. About 1,000 feet from their house is the old house. As soon as we got out of the path of the light, my blood ran cold. Chills. It was eerie. The guys immediately wimped out and wanted to go back. At this point, we were about 30 feet away from being able to see the house, and at this point, that's all we wanted to do, and I didn't want to have come all this way for nothing. I kind of shoulder past them, deciding to be the brave one. As I do so, I gave the surrounding area one last sweep with my flashlight just to make sure of no surprises. Remember the farmette? There are cows on that farm, as well as cats and horses. This was in my full knowledge. Earlier in the day, I had seen the horse in the paddock, so as soon as we reached the farmette, I knew to check the area for the horse so that it didn't catch us by surprise. I did an entire sweep of the paddock. The horse was not there. Nothing was. However, as I gave that last sweep of the area, my flashlight beam fell on this enormous, hulking, hairy thing with huge glowing eyes. It looked like a 7-foot-tall, standing, man creature, but with hair all over its body, and massive glowing eyes. Nothing remotely like a horse. Anyway, I let out this bone-chilling scream, which scared the guys enough to send them running without much of a glance at what I was looking at. The guys tell me it was the horse. I'm totally not convinced. I've spent my entire life riding and training horses, and this thing looked nothing like a horse. The giveaway? Its eyes were on the front of its head, not the side. To begin with, I am as non-religious as it gets. This is my only experience, which still makes me question myself. I was around 6 years old, at our old house. I shared a room with my sister at the time. Both of our beds touched the same wall, and were separated by a nightstand. The room is square in shape, and attached to the rest of the house via a longish corridor. My sister was around 4 at the time. I woke up sometime during the night, not sure when, I couldn't tell time, and must have been late since no one was awake and the highway from my room sounded rather empty of cars. As I fiddled about in my bed, I opened my eyes and looked towards my ceiling. I see 2 small children, floating about 4 feet away from me. They were greenish in color, and their edges were not well defined from space around them. They giggled as they noticed me, noticing them. I didn't know, and couldn't tell if that was a safe giggle. I decide I must be still shaky from sleep, and close my eyes to continue sleep, and make them disappear. I reopen my eyes and there they still were, slightly closer. I get real scared now. I repeat closing my eyes, and there they were closer. Now I freaked. They were about 2.5 feet away now. I jumped from my bed, and I ran towards my door, and the hallway. I paused at the door to see behind me. They gasped as I ran, and when I looked back they had turned their heads to face me. I ran again, this time for my mom's bedroom. I jumped into her bed shaking, and slept there. Till this day I regret leaving my sister in there, but I was too afraid to have done anything else. I've told few people in my life about this. A cousin of a friend of mine independently told me a story she experienced as a child too, and without any knowledge of my experience described the little floating children she saw as dim glowing green. I hate remembering this story. This story was unveiled to me by my uncle, when he was drunk. Whenever I ask him to repeat it he tells me to stop asking, says that he doesn't want to talk about it and thanks me for stopping him from sleeping that night. Needless to say, we don't bring it up very often. My uncle lived in an old English cottage, wooden beams, wonky ceilings, strange stairs and creaking floorboards, the works. He suffered from constant nightmares as a child, and they all seemed to be part of the same story. There would always be a boy that walked down his street in tattered clothes, went to the window and knocked on it. My uncle would look, causing the boy to scream. That was the point where my uncle would wake up. Wherever he was the dream seemed to adapt, sleeping in a car window, camping, outside the tent. It all seemed a bit too coincidental that this same boy would keep appearing in all his dreams. This carried on until he was 14, he was in the car with his mother, sleeping, when the car crashed. He says he heard the same scream, the window smash and then he woke up. They had ran into a boy, the same boy from the dreams, who proceeded to crash through the windscreen and land on his lap. His cold dying eyes fixed on my uncle as if he had seen him before, like he was death itself. That stare haunts my uncle, and had to go through months of therapy to get over it. My parents and I lived in a 2-bedroom apartment here in Southern California. I would sleep in my own room on a full-sized bed, my parents' room being just down the hall. I always used to be afraid of that room, it used to creak way too much, though now I know it was just the old rickety closets, and I never had a nightlight so I'd always sleep in the dark. I just felt a dark, really uncomfortable atmosphere in that room and in fact I'd never be in there unless it was bedtime. Well, whenever bedtime did come my mom or dad would lay in bed with me until I fell asleep. Then they would leave and go to their own room obviously. Here is where things get strange. I would always have a dream. To be completely honest I cannot remember if it was a dream or reality, it felt extremely real to me though, that the bed would start shaking. At first it felt like an innocent rocking then it would feel like a huge rattle. I'd wake up, seriously startled, and check under the bed. When I did I would see either a demon or Satan's face grinning at me with an evil grin. I would run out of the room and hide in the living room and somehow I would lose him / it. I'd then go sleep in my parents' bed and wake up in their bed as well. However, there were times where the demon / Satan or whatever the evil entity was did catch me with their arms and then I'd fall onto the ground and be dragged under the bed. I would see stars and then complete darkness. I'd wake up in my bed crying and my parents could not figure out what was wrong. This all kept happening until I was 10, that's when we moved out of that apartment for financial reasons, but God I can still remember it to this day and it scares me. Me and my friends went to go on a hike / smoke some bowls one day after school. Halfway down the trail we saw an old woman with a dog about 10 feet off the trail. We were trying to get to a more secluded area to smoke, so we just tried to waltz past her. She stands up and asks, "Can I ask you boys a question?" We stop and say sure, whatever, and she says, "Do you like this forest?" And we hesitate and say yeah sure it's nice, and she says you shouldn't. This forest is a nuclear forest. It's dying, can't you see it? It was weird, so me and John were just like okay whatever, but my other friend Ben was a little smart ass and said, "Ma'am it's just fall, this happens every year." She laughs and says, No, it's nuclear. I used to love coming here before I died, before it became nuclear." We went dead quiet at this point. She suddenly screamed, "Did you hear what I said? I died." At this point me and Ben were on one side of her, while John stood alone on the other side. When she screamed this she started doing a weird run thing towards Ben and me. I stand my ground but Ben goes on a straight ducking sprint off the trail, jumping over trees and shit, to get to John. She stopped running and said, whilst pointing to us, "If you ever touch one of God's daughters before her time, you will spend a lifetime in hell burning for your mistakes." We just stood there and she walked off. Damn near expected her to fly away. I live in an old 1800s farmhouse across the street from a small cemetery. The family who built this house are buried there, along with decades worth of friends and in-laws. I'm not sure where to start except to say I feel protected, like this house wouldn't allow any harm to enter the premises. The house needs TLC and fixing up, and I've done a lot, but as I go along I will make mental lists of things I need to pick up: a fireplace poker, new panes of glass, a giant dustpan. I can't remember everything now, but they always show up before I buy them. The fireplace poker showed up on the front porch. I went to the basement for something else and found a stack of glass panes that I wasn't even looking for. I was cleaning out the garage wishing for a giant dustpan when I bent down to pick something up and there was a giant dustpan that had been out of view when standing. Small coincidences, but interesting enough. I just started jokingly wishing for things, and I get them. In the winter I cook on a wood stove and started pushing it to see what I can cook without using electricity. I can make bread and cupcakes. I started making cappuccinos too, but didn't have a stainless steel creamer to steam milk in. That's what I need, I thought, and then I found one that same night, in plain view, when I wasn't looking for it. When I decided to paint the bedrooms and tallied up the cost of all the paint I'd need, I thought, okay, where is this money coming from? The next day I got a notice that I had $800 in unclaimed funds coming my way. The bedrooms are now painted. I started putting the cemetery graves on Find a Grave, because if I don't do it no one will. I was doing it with my phone, taking pictures and jotting down names and dates. I didn't tell anyone I was doing this. 2 days into it, my neighbor who borders the cemetery showed me something he found in his barn, a handwritten record of everyone buried there up to 1930. I've scanned it and am transcribing it to Excel. It almost felt like someone was afraid to be left out. I've heard hoedown music coming from a room I don't use. There's one lamp but otherwise no electronics or appliances in there. One day working in the backyard I was thinking about the family who built this house. They lost a few children between censuses. I thought to myself, she must have burned one tough mama, and just then my kitchen radio came on and played That Which Doesn't Kill You Makes You Stronger. When the song was over the radio went back off. I wake up to the smell of baking bread. One night the whole house smelled like fudge and I went up and down and around the house trying to figure out where it was coming from. This stuff doesn't happen daily, but enough that when it does I just smile and say, thank you. I'm pretty sure I'm not alone, but I'm not scared. Me and my buddy went hiking pretty late one night, right before sunset. We decided to travel up a hill to explore, and as we were hanging out up on the hill it began to rain. I'm not talking about regular rain, it felt like we were in a ducking hurricane. Anyways, we decided to start heading back because the sun was going down and it was already hidden by rain clouds. As we traveled down the hill we thought we heard footsteps behind us but just assumed it was the storm. We realized we had been going down the hill the wrong way, and by the time we made it back down to the trail it was totally dark and creepy. We continued to walk on the trail back to my car. That's when we started to feel like we were getting hunted. The rain had calmed down by now so we could hear things around us better. We could hear twigs snapping and footsteps. Multiple footsteps. Still not sure if it was people or mountain lions. We noped out of there pretty fast. That's when it got really creepy. As we dried off and sat in my car and started recounting our epic journey, we both noticed a man just sitting in his car, which was down the street from us by about 20 feet. We didn't see him in the car when we walked past it, and we didn't see anyone approach the car since we got in ours. From our view, he appeared to just be sitting there and staring straight at our car. His head wasn't down like he was reading or anything. After about 10 minutes of us just staring at my mirrors watching this guy sit in his car, he turned on his headlights. After about 10 more minutes he slowly drove off. When I was a kid, we moved into a new house. My earliest memory was that my brother's room was always cold, but I never thought anything of it. When I got older, I moved into that room but it wasn't cold anymore. I asked my mom why the room was so cold and she told me that when we first moved in my sister actually took that room and she had a lot of nightmares, and when she woke up there was bruises up her legs and stomach. My mom would also get nightmares of a woman telling her to leave the house. She did a ritual or something and everything stopped, including the room not being cold no more. A few years later, my sister was getting married. My grandma and 3 female cousins I never met before came to stay at our place. My mom told me that grandma did not like staying at our place cause she would always get sick when she visited. My 3 cousins stayed in my sister's room, and after the second night they were here, they were really scared and said that someone was trying to open their door. They kept seeing the doorknob jiggle, and when they opened it no one was there. They came to my room and asked if they can sleep in there, and I thought they were trying to scare me but I played along. I slept on the floor and they took my bunk bed and suddenly I hear the washer turn on. The washer room was next to my room and I went out there and turned it off. Then I went back to my room and outside my door I hear chains dragging across the room, but when I opened the door, no one was there. This really freaked me out because for all the years I lived here nothing ever happened. I eventually fell asleep. The next morning, I went to my sister's room to check things out because I was curious. When I opened the door I saw 2 things that freaked me out. There was these faint black marks on the ceiling like footsteps and the windows was open. What's so scary about the window being opened? Someone installed the second glass of the windows wrong, so it could only be opened from the outside. We lived on the 2nd floor and it was impossible to open unless you had a ladder. It freaked me out for a while, and when everyone left, nothing weird happened. I talked to my mom about it afterwards, and she said that the house doesn't like new people and females. This explained why I never saw or experienced anything except for the cold room, and why my grandma always got sick. After that, once in a while when I was sleeping, I would sometimes hear a baby crying. I assumed it was my neighbor's baby but never thought anything of it. When we moved out, my mom forced me to go say bye to all our neighbors even if I never talked to them. When I said bye to the family next door that had the baby crying, I asked how the baby was doing and they said they don't have a baby. About 7 years after I moved away from the house, I went back to visit. When I went to my room, it had changed a lot and it was bigger. I asked the current owner about why it was bigger, and they said that the closet that used to be in my room had a hidden space behind it, making the closet twice the size. I asked them if they found anything in there and they said no. I don't know if that had anything to do with all the weird stuff I saw, but it was just another weird thing I learned about that house years later. When I was around 7, my grandmother took care of a baby whose mother was an alcoholic and drug addict. This woman would bring her child, let's call him John, to my grandmother's house and leave him there for months at a time. Needless to say, our family became very attached and thought of him as part of the family. His mother came to get him one night and her drunk boyfriend flips the car. John was in a coma for about 3 or 4 days. One night my older brother wakes everyone in the house up screaming and crying, saying that John is dead. Once my parents get him calmed down, he tells them that John came into his room crying, saying that he has to leave but he is scared and wants my brother to come with him. While my parents are trying to convince my brother that it was just a dream, the phone rings and it is my uncle calling from the hospital to inform us that John had died. This happened over 30 years ago, but I still get goosebumps thinking about it. My 4-year-old daughter was supposedly asleep when I heard noise coming from her upstairs bedroom. I tried to listen but could not make out what was being said. I approached the room, and she stopped talking. Thinking I alarmed her, I went into the room. At the time she was sharing it with her 3-year-old sister. I walked in and saw the 4-year-old sitting up in bed. I smiled and said, "Is everything okay?" She said fine, but her sister said they were keeping her up. I asked who? My 4-year-old said sorry but that she was talking. When I asked her who she was talking to, my 3-year-old sat up and said, "The girl in the window, she said you were coming." After I shit a brick, I asked who the girl was and they both said a girl comes and stands in front of the window at night and talks to them. Not knowing what to say, I said okay, tucked them in and hung around outside their door. The next day I asked about the girl. They said she came back but was mad. I waited a few days and asked again. My 4-year-old said the girl in the window was still mad. I forgot about it for about a week, when my wife said, "Who are the girls talking to upstairs?" Freaked out, I ran upstairs and both girls were sitting under the window looking up. They turned and looked at me and asked if I wanted to meet the girl. When they turned around, disappointed, they said the girl left. It has been about 5 years since and I have not heard about the girl in the window since then. Up until I was about 6 or 7, I kept having strange dreams. It was kind of like a TV show. I'd watch this woman's life play out in a series of events. I didn't even know who the lady was I kept seeing in my dreams. Most of it was random stories, like her coming home from work one day to find out her oldest daughter had locked her sister out of the house naked. I had dreams of watching this woman beat her children. I watched this woman and her boyfriend get into drugs. I watched them shoot up heroin before I even knew what it was. I even watched this woman die of AIDS in a hospital bed. None of it made sense to me until I even watched this woman's funeral. The last dream I ever had was the boyfriend behave inappropriately the oldest daughter. Throughout that entire horrific scene, I could hear the woman's voice, "Tell her I'm sorry. Please Vanessa, tell her I'm sorry." I should have listened. At this point I woke up majorly panicked, not just from what I had seen, but because this woman called out to me by name. So I finally go to my mom and I'm talking so fast, trying to get it all out. And my mom is just standing there with her jaw to the floor as I'm recalling my dreams, and her childhood memories. When I get to the apology, she started to sob uncontrollably. I want to note that my mother never told me anything about my grandma, or her childhood prior to these dreams. I had never even seen a photograph of her. I'm 19 years old, in my dorm room, it's the middle of day and I'm scared shitless, duck. This story actually reminds me of my childhood. When I was 8 I started sleeping in my basement on a couch. My dad slept on another couch perpendicular to mine. It was cooler in our basement and I was closer with my dad more than my mom, who slept on the top story of our house. Well, the couch I slept on was right under some windows, so I would look out at night and scream and freak myself out thinking someone was there. My dad eventually put pillows in the window for me so I couldn't look out. My dad passed away a year or so later, right before my 12th birthday, in our basement suddenly from a heart attack. I was too terrified to go back into our basement for a while, but eventually I did, and I started sleeping on my couch again. One night the pillow fell out of blocking the window. I woke up and looked out and started getting scared, then noticed I wasn't imagining someone standing there. There was a person standing there. But I noticed they were pacing back and forth in front of the windows, as if they were guarding them. The person looked just like my dad. I'm almost positive it was. I blinked and fell back asleep. I woke up, the figure was gone and I never saw it again. I was able to sleep without the pillows blocking the windows from then on though. I live near a camp that I used to attend as a child. When I was 7, there was a counselor at the camp who was Russian. The camp has a very large staff exchange program with many different countries, and very weird at that. Counselors said he was incredibly fast, and during staff-only campfires he would catch, skin, and eat live rabbits. He could do this crazy, sleeper hold move. It essentially was a strangling move that knocked you out for a few seconds, you came to, and were fine a minute later. I saw him do it on a counselor once. The guy was out for about 10 seconds. He was forbidden to do it after that. However, kids got curious and started asking him to do the move. He would do it in secret, but he would increase the severity of his holds, which would in turn keep the kid knocked out for a longer period of time. One day, a camper went missing. He wasn't in his bunk, despite going to bed with his cabin that night. They did a camp-wide search, keeping us all on the soccer field for about 2 hours. The counselors had to start searching the water. They found his body under the sailing dock, completely out cold. He had the strangle marks around his neck. Everyone knew who it was. They arrested the Russian guy, and deported him back to Russia. Turns out they never even sent an exchange counselor. Nobody knew who the duck he was.